Bonjour, Kenwea. My name is Patricia McGiskin. I'm the Special Education Support Technician with the Chiefs of Ontario. I'd like to welcome all, all the First Nation education teams, all participants to our session today on education service agreements. Uh, I would also like to acknowledge where I am now, the city of Thunder Bay, in which um, was built on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe people and the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty 1850. I would respectfully acknowledge that all of our work and the work of our First Nation partners takes place on traditional Indigenous homelands across the province. We are grateful to be able to work and live in these homelands. We are thankful to the First Nation, Métis, and the Inuit people who have cared for the homelands since time immemorial and who continue to strengthen our homeland province. So today I'd like to welcome Shelley Knott Fife, and she can take it away from here. Welcome, Shelley.
Bonjour, bonjour. Anin, Nigwagan Indigenous cause, Ashki Gomong, Donjaba, Nishnaba Kwa and Dao, Makwa Gamigizi, Dodamwa. Otherwise, I'm Shelley Knott Fife from Curve Lake here, where I've lived, breathed, and worked for most of my life. I'm from here. I'd say most of my life because I did a stint down in Waterloo Way after I graduated from university back in the dark ages when we went to school by horse and buggy. And I hung around there for a bit, came back here to raise my kids. So I am so grateful that you all took time out of your busy days. I know it's a crazy month in education. So, and I appreciate that everybody's keeping their screen off because it's a lunch and learn and you're probably all munching on your lunches. And I know that we don't like to have people watch us as we eat. So I appreciate that screens are off. But I encourage you to raise your hand whenever. I'm going to ask Patricia to keep her eye on the chat for me because I won't necessarily pay attention to that. And I see some familiar faces or names, so it's really nice that you joined us because I know that you're probably as versed as I am in education agreements, but appreciate you being here and maybe adding to the knowledge. And just a bit of background of myself, though, for those who I'm just meeting for the first time or just seeing me for the first time. I'm from Curve Lake First Nation. I started out in my education career as manager of education back early 2000, I think, and worked there for a while. Went to work for the Ministry of Education as an Aboriginal education officer. Then I did the last 14 years or so with the Indigenous Services Canada as an education specialist. I retired from the ISC a year ago, March, over a year already. And so I've just been plugging away on different things, including, being contracted a bit with Chiefs of Ontario and various other organizations to deliver these kinds of workshops. I have a Bachelor of Ed. I have a Master's of Science in Special Education from Purdue, and I'm currently on the last leg of my PhD in special education. So I had a meeting with my committee yesterday, and it looks like end of July is when this puppy should be good to be defended. So I'm hoping that we can arrange that defense early fall or late summer. So that's where I am. I am really happy that big project is on the downward slope. So with all of that background that I've come out of, I have negotiated a lot of education agreements. I've negotiated on behalf of the government. I've negotiated on behalf of some First Nations, and I've become quite familiar with the workings of education agreements formally education service agreement. So I'm going to share my screen now and go through this PowerPoint. And if I'm talking too fast, which I tend to do, give Patricia a nudge through the chats, or, you know, wave frantically in the, open your camera and wave frantically or something. Anyway, again, congrats for being here. Here we go. So, education services agreements, I guess the ministry is now calling them education agreements. There was a time they switched to education service agreements, and then they went to, they were tuition agreements originally. So whatever you call them is really up to you when it comes to negotiating. Many people do feel that education service agreements really kind of captures a lot of it, but you may have to reference education agreements because that's what the province is now referring to them as. And so I'm going to be talking about education agreements in the context especially of special education. Just to overview what we'll cover, and I'm have to talk kind of quickly because this is a lunch and learn, and we'll be over by 12:30, make over a little bit, try to keep it within that hour. So we'll talk about the process of developing an education service agreement. We'll talk about the legislation, creating policy and funding, indigenizing special education plans, but I'll be going into more detail about education plans next Tuesday if you want to come back. Early identification, assessment, transition planning, and programs and support. And then we'll take some time for question Q&As. The Choose Ontario has a really good video. I'll see if I can get that going here for a second. And it kind of gives a really good overview. It takes a couple of seconds. So I'm just going to run that, and then we'll expand on it. Sorry, I had to queue up more better. Been out of the professional realm a little too long.
Ashley, can you come to the front desk, please? Ashley, front desk.
Oh, somebody's.
Sure that their students have the support they need, like transportation, language classes, and accommodations for those with special needs. First Nations have negotiated education agreements with school boards for decades. They can be a wonderful relationship building tool. The reciprocal education approach, or REA, is a base tuition fee paid by school boards and First Nations. It ensures that a First Nation student is admitted to a school board, and conversely, that a First Nation school has the authority to admit or refute a student. But it does not always cover all the services and support First Nation students need. Education agreements allow for well-negotiated solutions that incorporate REA. It's a win-win-win for students, First Nations, and school boards. Honey, this is Dakota. He lives in a small city but goes to school in his First Nation community. Dakota's community school is cool because they have many classes and activities that make you feel at home. The school has daily Anishinaabe-born classes, awesome land-based activities like fishing, trapping, and snowshoeing. Dakota School also has elders, language teachers, cultural coordinators, and education assistants that make Dakota feel safe, valued, and proud to be First Nations. Like Dakota, some students who live off reserve decide to attend school in First Nation communities. Negotiating education agreements for these students is important, as the REA covers the base tuition fee. So what's not covered under the base tuition fee? Well, a lot actually. Important things like education service standards, First Nations language and culture courses, additional special education services and equipment, access to student data, and having a say in who school boards hire to promote First Nations student success, well-being, and achievement. Sego. As a First Nations education manager, Sarah understands the value of having an education agreement in place for their students and community. Their community has negotiated for better diversity practices, including hiring more First Nations teachers at the school board. They have also included student transition supports, aggregate student data, and curriculum reflecting First Nations culture, values, and history. Their education agreement gives them a tool to advocate for their students' well-being and success. Negoli. This is Nimki, and they attend grade 12 at a public school 20 minutes outside of their home community. At first, Nimki was nervous about attending school outside of their community, but they soon learned that their community has education with the school board that makes sure they have the access to support services that are designed specifically for students from their First Nation. The school's First Nations culture and student well-being support worker has been a great support to them. This year, Nimki is on track to graduate with honors. Well done, Nimki. Students like Sage, Dakota, and Nimki are just a few of the many First Nations students who benefit from an education agreement. Chiefs of Ontario has generated an education agreement template to make negotiating your EA easy. For more information, please visit education.chiefsofontario.org.
Yeah, so that's a really good overview, actually, that they did. And so we'll try and expand on that, but it's a good high level kind of conversation. So I'll go back to my PowerPoint here. Okay, so the timeline for your education agreement, if you're either in the position right now where you're renewing your agreement or you're starting a new negotiation if you've never had an agreement. And again, if you've just joined that, it's an education agreement, formally education services agreement or tuition agreement. Typically, you may establish a committee or you may be just doing it on your own. It depends on how many resources you have in your community. But you can establish a committee locally, like, maybe your council, counselor that's from council, your portfolio. Maybe you want some parents on there, or if you have an education committee, they might be part of this conversation. You want to identify issues. What really do you need to ensure is in that agreement? What are the important things that you want to make sure is part of that conversation? You're going to negotiate with the school board, sign the agreement, and then you go back to the cycle of renewing agreement and continuing through that cycle. I wanted to stress, though, in the video, it talked about the RIA. Now, that is the reverse or reciprocal education approach that the province introduced several years ago. One of the first reciprocal education agreements, though, happened about, I think that was like early 2000s. And I think Grandma was the first one, where students who are off reserve attending a school on reserve the First Nation could then bill the school board for tuition for those students attending the on reserve school. Now that has developed to the province and provincial school boards, understanding they have to deliver programming to any student that comes into their schools. First Nations, though, still have the autonomy and power to say whether or not they're responsible for those students. So, for example, if a student who is on reserve decides to go to a school of their choice, where that maybe the First Nation doesn't have an agreement with or is not in the process of paying tuition to them, the First Nation can say to the school board that this school isn't included in part of the tuition agreement, or we don't have an agreement with your board, so we're not really going to be addressing that. But the school board is kind of in the position where they have to deliver education for whoever shows up. So there's all kinds of little scenarios like that within that reciprocal education approach. But if you have students off reserve attending your First Nation students, this mechanism allows you to bill the the school board. I'm not going to go into detail on that. Unless you have questions, I can probably address your questions, but I'm not going to go into detail about negotiating REAs. It's along the similar vein as negotiating a regular education agreement. It's just reciprocal, hence the name. And that's different. That unfortunately, REA is the same acronym as the regional education agreements that ISC is in the process of negotiating with some people too. So that's unfortunate that they're all using the same acronym. Basic responsibilities with ESAs are education agreements and tuition agreements. From the school board, they prepare the list of students that they believe are enrolled from the First Nation, that they understand to be enrolled from the First Nation. And then they'll invoice the First Nation, including a calculation of fees. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then a final adjustment may be made to the First Nations if the First Nation says, well, these students aren't on reserve, actually, they don't, so they wouldn't be included as part of the tuition agreement. So that's where the adjustments are made when that clarity of who is included in the tuition agreement is made. First Nations finalize the nominal roll. They compare lists between the nominal roll of the First Nation and the school board, and then they provide payment to the according to the invoice of the board. Now, ISC, Indigenous Services Canada, is outside of the tuition, the education agreements. They just verify the nominal roll as submitted by the First Nation to ISC, including duplications from other First Nations, because that nominal roll drives the funding from ISC. So they provide the nominal roll list to First Nations that they understand to exist, and First Nation provides updates and just clarifies what that that nominal roll should look like. Included within the cost of tuition. Now, it used to be called the Grant for Student Need, and recently it's kind of been changed to core education funding. So if you've heard presentations by me in the past or by the province even, they would have been talking about the GSN, the Grant for Student Need. Now they call it core education funding. So within that core education funding, which drives the cost of tuition, so whatever the school board gets from the ministry within their core education funding, and when I'm talking core education funding, I mean that pot of money that the school board gets from the Ministry of Education. It is not what you get from Indigenous Services Canada. The money now that you get from Indigenous Services Canada is largely based on this due to the interim funding formula. The idea of the interim funding formula is that it's based on the core education funding. So there is similarities in terms which may get confusing, but as far as this conversation is concerned, that cost of tuition is driven by that core education funding. So whatever a school board gets from the Ministry of Education in core education funding, that should translate into the amount of tuition that you're being charged. They really shouldn't be charging you more than what they get in core education funding. Now, within that core education funding is included the classroom teachers, education assistants, and I'll talk about that a little later again. Textbooks, learning materials, classroom supplies, essentially all that is required to teach your students. Special education is included in the cost of tuition. what used to be a separate allocation under the special education per pupil amount, the SEPA amount, that included education assistance, student assistance, instructional materials, consultants, and so on, and the high needs amount, HNA. They used to be separate amounts that school boards got from the ministry, but it's now all part of core education funding. Therefore, it's now all part of the tuition that you pay. So, and that's been the case since 2006. The grant for student need, now the core education funding. So this isn't new. And unfortunately, I know a lot of First Nations were still charged extra for special education. And so that was like, there's a lot of old guard in school boards that didn't understand that there had been a shift. And First Nations may not have been aware that this was all now part of the core education funding. So I'll go into a bit more detail about that in a minute, but just so you're aware that within the cost of tuition, all of this is included. Talking about the special education costs that are not part of tuition, those are the costs that would normally need to be applied by a school board to the Ministry of Ed for non-tuition paying pupils of the board. So if you're looking at students of the board that are not in tuition agreements, education agreements, ESAs, this is what they would do if they needed extra money from the ministry for their students of the board. They would apply for a special equipment amount and a special incident portion. And those applications, and you often hear me say that they're about an inch thick. They have to really prove that those students need this extra support. So when I'm just sharing this to you as an example of what the school boards have to go through to get additional money from the ministry for students not on tuition agreements. The First Nations aren't part of this process. They can't apply for the CIAs or SIPs, but it can be the process that you develop or refer to when school boards approach you and say your student needs more support and you need to pay for it. So just be aware of the process if they were to approach the ministry for other students of the board that are not on First Nations. The special equipment amount is claims based, and essentially the boards pay the first 800, even of tuition, even kids on tuition agreements, and then anything above that, any costs above that, they would ask the ministry for additional dollars, or they would ask you if they're part of a tuition agreement. Special incidents proportion. Now, this is still an issue. I can't believe that, I've been talking about this issue for the last 20 years. However, here we are. School boards go to the ministry with this application for students who need 2 or more EAs round the clock. And that's the only time they can go to the ministry for additional dollars. It's that extra support would only be up to 28,803 in 2023. That's how much they got for those students in additional costs. So when they're charging you for the full cost of an EA, and saying this student's not going to get support unless you pay this whole cost of the EA, they can't go to the ministry and say that for any other student. So just be aware of that. However, I understand that you do have budgets for special education, so you can negotiate within your education agreement that, where we want to enhance services for our students, this is how we want to pay for it. This is what we'll provide. This is the process for going through that conversation and decision of how much money gets paid in extra and under what conditions. So you certainly have the prerogative to pay for more if you want to, or if you can. And but just know that if it was any other student of the board, this is the process they would have to go to get that money from the ministry. And I say that because by virtue of paying tuition, your students are students of the board. So they have access to all of these services just by virtue of paying tuition. The education agreements, education service agreements / tuition agreements, that is the foundation for the relationship that you're building with the school board. And that's where, you know, and it helps those coming in after you, or especially in the board side, to say, this is the foundation we've laid. This is the conversation that we've had about how we're going to work together to deliver education for our kids. But it's good to know how they function within their funding from the ministry. I know that this gets confusing, and but conversation's been around 20 years, so I'm happy to share it with you whenever and wherever. Tips for including special education in tuition agreements. So I'm just going right back to old school and calling them tuition agreements. But as you know, education agreements, education service agreements, whatever you want to call them. Have an open dialogue with the school board or local school about your children's special education needs. You know, I even had an education school board director say to me a few years ago, First Nation kids come in with a deficit, and I nearly lost my mind. So I said, okay, we need to have a conversation about this. You want to explain yourself? And he walked it back, but I'm like, so, you know, don't, if you want to, as I said, provide that extra support and services for your kids, absolutely. But don't accept that they're just writing off your kids because of who they are. Clearly identify what additional costs will be paid by First Nations beyond the base tuition rate. So that's where I'll show you an example of what that could look like in an addendum or in a phrase. Specify when special education reports are due and the level of information that is required from the school board. So often, some of you may still have special education reports due to ISC, and I know that in the past, at least, First Nations often waited until they got information from the school board before they completed those reports. So have that understanding with the school board that you do require some basic aggregate type of information. Even if it's specific to a certain student, that can be anonymous because they're in Indigenous Services Canada, the reports aren't identifiable by student. It's just an identifier that you make up. So it's not, shouldn't be anything that ISC or even school boards would understand. Specify the process that the board must follow in order to request funds from the base tuition fee. And that's what I was talking about in terms of how you are going to be delivering more resources for your students in special ed. And acknowledge it, especially acknowledge how special education will appear in that agreement, often in a detailed addendum. Here's an example of an addendum. Sometimes you may just reference it in general in the actual body of the agreement, something to the effect of special education will be addressed according to this addendum or appendix. And then you go into all the details. This is an example, as I said, it's not the end all and be all. I have an example sample tuition agreement, education agreement that I'm happy to share, but there's also really good examples on the Chiefs of Ontario website under resources for education. So, you know, you might have your principles listed. All students can succeed. Students are educated in their community schools if this is more enabling environment. This is just a sample.
That's good.
That's good.
Informative.
It is?
Yeah,
That's
it's on education.
good.
Sorry, Darlene.
What, you're gonna go
I
to
think
the
you
AFM?
Darlene,
I don't know.
Darlene, I think you want to be muted.
Oh, sorry. Hold on. Sorry. Hold on.
I'm glad you're finding it informative. That's great. The board, for example, agrees to provide high-cost special education services and equipment to meet the identified high-cost special education needs of pupils within the existing processes of the board. So that's one sample phrase. This PowerPoint, or this whole workshop actually is going to be available online. So I'm not going to go through all of these. And there is a toolkit, a special or education services agreement, tuition agreement, education agreement, resource guide online as well. And it has a lot of, it's like a catalog of good phrases, phraseology for what you can incorporate into your tuition agreement. Jordan's principle, and ESAs and tuition agreements. In recognition of Jordan's principle provides that where a government service is available to all other children, but a jurisdictional dispute regarding services to a First Nation child arises between Canada, province, and territory, or between government departments, the government department of first contact pays for the service and can seek reimbursement from other government or departments after the child has received the service. It's a child first principle meant to prevent First Nation children from being denied essential public services or experiencing delays in receiving them. So that's the actual principle. It's not the initiative, like it is the foundation of the initiative that exists right now, where you can apply for funds for those services. But your agreement could include how you're going to address this. Because I often hear First Nations say too that I wish they had approached us first parents, because we did have the money to address that need. And now, you know, by bypassing the First Nation, my First Nation has access funding, or school boards are in a similar position where, you know, somebody might go straight to asking money for an EA or whatever, and they never really went through the process to see if that's a valid need. And sometimes schools end up with a lot of EAs in a classroom, and that's actually a big burden on teachers, because that's somebody who they have to manage. So try to open that conversation about what's realistic and productive, because I'm willing to, I'm interested in the research to see how many, if the number of EAs in the classroom really expands the progress of students. Because you know, EAs do great work, but I'm not, but there's still a role that teachers play in a classroom and managing the classroom. So I won't get into that conversation, but anyway, that's where Jordan's principle kind of aligns with the agreements, in that you can have that conversation with school boards and how are we going to address applications to Jordan's principle, especially if the funding's not sustainable. If they get funding one year and not the next year, it's not it may not be a long-term plan for a student. A sample of phraseology that you can incorporate into your agreement. Regarding special education and Jordan's principle, efforts will be made by both parties to ensure that all existing resources are adequately accessed. Prior to any consideration by the board towards an application for funding from Jordan's principle initiative, there will be consultation with the First Nation to determine if that application is necessary. That's a sample. You can word it however you want. And this isn't legal advice. That just in this discussion, I'm always kind of prefacing, should have done this at the beginning. Not a legal advice. You can have your lawyer, you know, have a final look at it, at whatever you produce. But I've negotiated quite a few, and they've all been approved by lawyers. So you have a good shot at getting it approved by your lawyer by what we're talking about. Again, it depends on where your First Nation is in terms of stance. So the guiding legislation for education agreements, Ontario Regulation 188, it outlines the frame for how education services are arranged for on-reserve students who attend provincial schools. Now, the Education Ontario Regulation 188 of the Education Act, I should preface that. The Education Act dictates to school boards through the Ministry of Ed how they're to carry out the delivery of education. First Nations aren't really, we really don't have to follow provincial legislation, but a lot of us feel on it. I mean, some of it is good guidance. So, where unless you're licensed by the province to deliver courses, most secondary schools on reserve are registered with the province to deliver Ontario credits. So it's similar. We have to follow provincial road laws because we're licensed to drive according to provincial laws. So if you're licensed by the province to deliver education, then you're guided by the Education Act. But if you have, for example, a primary junior school, you're not restricted to the Education Act. So a tuition agreement, it's a legal and binding agreement. So once you sign it, then you can always refer back to it as your foundation of how you're doing business together in the delivery of education. While all school boards operate under the same provincial legislation and guidelines, each further develops their own policy and procedures. So a tuition agreement isn't your policy and procedure. It is just the agreement between school boards and First Nation. You still can develop your own policy and procedures and develop your agreement accordingly. Say, no, our policy and procedure on our First Nation is this, and this is how we're going to conduct that piece of the agreement. While the calculation of fees is standard across the province, so that calculation of fees, which translates into the tuition, that calculation is standard, but the provision of specific services can still be determined between you and the school board. Though First Nations are not bound by provincial education legislation, we can still utilize our knowledge of provincial legislation to work with school boards to ensure quality education for our young people. So it's good to have a familiarity with what's important in the Education Act when you're negotiating this. Although some school boards may not even know all that's included in an Education Act. Where a First Nation secondary school wishes to grant, as I mentioned before, if the secondary school on reserve grants Ontario secondary credits, they have to adhere to legislative requirements, including registration and inspections under the Ministry of Ed. Creating policy, and this is what I'll go into next week, where First Nations can develop their own education program policies. Typically based on ISC's National Education Program guidelines, but if you've looked at the guidelines, especially and compared them to maybe 20 years ago or so, they are not as, they got more flexibility. The parameters aren't quite as concrete as they may have been in the past, especially now when a lot of money is in core and you get more flexibility and autonomy in how you spend that. So your education program policies are your own. Funding, education funding for First Nation students, and I talked to this before a little bit. So for First Nation students normally residing on reserve, it's provided by the federal government through ISC, directly to First Nations through funding agreements. Education funding for students of the board in provincial schools, that is students not covered under an ESA education agreement, is provided by the Ministry of Ed through the provincial school boards. So the Ministry of Ed pays the provincial school boards, funds the provincial school boards, and they provide service for students of the board. Indigenizing special education plans and policy. And just briefly, a good foundation for school or education organization special education program is a special education plan, even for First Nation students with First Nations with students who only attend provincial schools. So you can still have your own policy. Who has access to the education officers that you employ, for example, who work in the provincial schools? Who has access to that? How do you hire them? Are they under the school board's personnel policy, or are they under yours? Those kinds of things are things that you might want to get into a plan or policy. And again, plans / policy, it's a very thin line. So Whatever you put into your plan is typically your policy. So how you want, whichever egg or chicken you want to do first, it's up to you. First Nation communities can build their own plan based on the provincial model or by using locally developed standards. And we're getting more closer towards that autonomous state of where we're setting our own rules and setting our own expectations for our students. So when you develop your plan and policy, that's what you can keep in mind. At a provincial level, every Ontario Provincial School Board is required by law to have a special education plan. So if you want to see what's going on in the school board that you work with, their plan's online, and it's usually quite thick. First Nation plans don't have to be that thick because I mean, it's still bureaucracy, right? The government there is still pretty bureaucratic and a lot of words, but they are all there, and they're really good structures to follow, maybe when developing your own, but we'll talk about that next week. So this is just a plug for the conversation we'll have next week. I just want to talk quickly about assessments. Early identification, there's a movement away from early identification, especially in daycares, for example, where it's very child-based, play-based learning. So you follow children's interests and their strengths rather than that early identification, the formal identifications. But some people, there's still, you know, some requirement for those identifications to see what are the signs, early signs. That's another story. That's another whole workshop, I think, to talk about identification and children. And I hope that you know, when I finish this dissertation, this is useful to you because I do go into a lot of research and talk about what our children's gifts are. So the types of assessments: psychoeducational, those that are strictly academic achievement to evaluate how students are performing in various school subjects. Developmental assessments, these are often the first option in determining if small children will need additional help. How does this all, how is it all relevant to tuition agreements? It's good to know what the school board provides. The school board, through the cost of your tuition, should provide all of this, even psychoeducational assessments. Although I know that there's a limited amount that each school board gives every year, you can still kind of make that within your agreement to say at least 1 or 2 spots are for our students. So something along that line. Now, there's developmental assessments. These are often the first option determining if small children will need additional help. Screening tests, curriculum-based assessments, adaptive behavioral assessments, and behavior rating scales. So just to get you familiar with some of the terminology and assessments if you're not always in the classroom or in schools. Early identification can be based on medical diagnosis or milestone checklists, as well as assessments. Ask what the purpose of each assessment is. What is the intended outcome of the findings? This will typically not be included in the essays, but it's good to know. There might be somewhere in your special education appendix that says that it addresses assessments. Psychoeducational assessments can be negotiated in the agreements. School boards typically have only a few assessments to allocate in a school year, as I mentioned, so you could kind of negotiate what your position in those lists look like. Transition plans are growing in importance and popularity between primary, intermediate, and secondary schools. They can be incorporated in principle in an agreement. For example, it can be stated that the board work with the First Nation to ensure successful transition occurs for First Nation students during those milestone times. For example, you know, the year building up to that transition, what's going to happen? What kind of exchange days or what kind of exchange of information is going to happen? And that's really important. Now, IEPs, You may or may not include those in the essays. The transfer, again, in the transition, the transfer of information through IEPs. How much can you be involved in those discussions of the IEPs? You, when I say you as the negotiator or the administrator, the education manager, is there a role for you in those conversations? And finally, programs and supports. Each provincial school board has a spec ed plan outlining all of those programs that are available for students. So it's good to look at those plans because everything in that plan is included in your tuition. So, okay, I'm ready to open this up for questions. There is a list of resources that's included in this presentation, and that's me. So,
Okay, Sally, we've got a question in the chat.
Yep.
What
So-
role does the Jordan's principle play in the development of the ESA?
yeah, as I had mentioned, it can help prevent that, circumventing processes. So if you have it stated in your agreement, when is the appropriate time to make a Jordan's principle application? Does the school board make them? Does the First Nation make it? You can have that conversation, or even just as I mentioned, the wording, a conversation about please let us know if you're going to go ahead and do an application. Let us know because we may already have something in place for that student. Does that answer your question, Dar? Okay. Any other questions? Or was I talking too fast? The invite to this session was shared with me. Where can I access the invite to the Lunch and Learn on June 24th? Patricia.
Yes, I can share it in the chat. Give me one moment.
And also make sure that you're on the mailing list with Holly. Holly, what's her last name?
Gulliback.
Sorry, Holly. Hollaback.
Gulliback.
And yeah, if you want to include that on the chat too, Patricia, that'd be great. Because any information coming out of Chiefs of Ontario usually comes through Holly. Okay. Yeah. I'll just put my information up there.
Oh, I froze.
I froze?
No,
Oh.
I did.
Oh, I probably just sat still for a minute.
And you want Holly, right?
Okay, great. Thanks, Jessica.
Hi, it's
Yeah.
Sherry Crowley. I'm from Anjanong. I'm a counselor from Anjanong First Nation.
Yeah, hi, Sherry.
Hi, how are you? It was nice to sit on and listen to your lunch and learn. I wanted you to go back to those resources so I could get a screenshot of that. I wanted
Okay.
to kind of look at those resources. Big Rich, thank you.
Yep.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. Okay, well. Everybody's still chewing on their sandwiches? There will be a quiz if you come next week. Kidding. I don't want the hassle of making up a quiz.
All right.
Yeah.
If there's, if there's no further questions, thank you very much, Shelley, for your time, and we look forward to the next session on special education. Thank you for your time, everybody.
Yep, see you next week.
Take care.
Just taking down your information. Yeah.